going to read from the New Testament this morning. We're going to actually carry on immediately following what we read last week. And in my Bible, this is titled, Jesus Calms the Storm. That day when the evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boats. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Thanks be to God for this reading. May it be blessed to our understanding. So this follows on immediately after the parables that we had read last week. In fact, it follows two parables before that. Chapter 4 of Mark contains that 4 parables and this story of nautical near disaster. Mark is like that. If you were to read the book of Mark from start to finish, you would end up short of breath and wondering how they kept up such a frantic pace. Mark always has these words, "and then," or "presently," or "next." It seems like in Mark's eyes, Jesus and the disciples were rushing through. But in their story today, it's not just a literary device. We see clearly, we're told clearly that this happened that same evening. Jesus said, "Let's cross to the other side." And so they got in the boat. They got in the boats. In fact, it probably makes sense for us to pick this apart a little bit before we get too deep into interpretation. We know on the surface of the story, probably a few of you could have told me maybe a one-sentence version of what went on. We've got Jesus and some disciples. We've got crazy weather, Jesus sleeping. He speaks to the storm, and it calms. You were all pretty familiar with that, right? That we're not breaking new ground here. But I think it makes sense that we dig a little deeper and find out really what we can know from the Scripture. First off, I'll admit that I didn't remember that there were more than one boat. There were many boats with them. I've read a few different translations of the Bible, and they range from boat to small ship. So, I don't know about you, I can remember my Sunday school years and the painting of a teeny little canoe with a ton of people standing in it, and maybe one measly little mast and a sail, and the waves crashing over it. Put that picture out of your head. These were probably not flimsy boats ready to break up at the slightest squall. These were fishing boats. These were the working boats of the people on the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Sea of Galilee does have a bit of a history of blowing up the storm in a moment's notice. I did a little bit of research, and it turns out that this stems from the winds that come down off of Mount Hermon, meeting with the winds that come from the East Lebanon Mountains, and they collide right in the middle, and they blow up the waves. These people in these boats would have known the stories in the Sea of Galilee. They would have known what happens when the sea gets angry. However, we need to think about the people in these boats. We know from the story that they were Jesus' disciples. And we need to remember that at least 4 of them, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they were fishermen. They were most likely from fishing families. These are the sorts of people who knew the water well. They knew their boats well. In fact, in Luke, we hear the story that it's actually Peter's own boat. He owns the boats that they go out in when the crowds are pressing and Jesus needs to speak to the crowds from the water. These are not casual people who popped on the water just one day. They knew the water well. And they knew the danger they were in. We should not be tempted to minimize the storm. For if these men who were hardened, experienced fishermen went to Jesus and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" They were fearing for their lives. So we know about the boats. We know about the people. But what did the people know about this man who was napping in the midst of a storm? We are only in the 4th chapter of Mark. This story comes fairly early in Mark's gospel. But Jesus' disciples by this time have seen him work some miracles of healing. They've seen the way that he teaches. They know the wisdom that he speaks with. They've gotten to know this man a little bit. They know that he can do things that no other person can do. And so when they turn to him in terror, saying, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" they were probably looking for help. For in the midst of the storm, their own strength, their own will, their own skill was not going to solve this. When we read stories like this, I think it's helpful to find ourselves in the story. And although it might bruise our egos a bit, we are invited to see ourselves in the spots of the disciples. For in this moment, the disciples are lost in the storms of life. I wonder how many of us here at some time or another have felt lost in the storms of our own lives. Caught up in circumstances that seem entirely outside of our control, even if sometimes we're guilty of starting them in motion. We get in these places where it seems like, even though this is our skill set and the thing we're good at, like the fishermen in the boat on the water, we should know what to do, but this thing that's happening, oh, it's too big for me. And how many of us in those moments look to God and say, "God, don't you care? Don't you care if I drown in this?" And sometimes, for some of us, the storms that we see might not be as personal as that. And they might, in fact, be bigger. They might be the storms of injustice that we see throughout the world. It could be something like the injustice that we see happening in the immigration policy south of the border. It could be the hurricane of rhetoric that seems to be tearing apart the tariff relationship between Canada and the United States. And that could, in fact, be the storm that's going to be too much for our small businesses and will wash us over and wipe us out. Perhaps it's unrest in the Middle East, Israel-Palestinian anger and terror that tears us apart. And we wonder, God, how can you let this happen? Don't you care if they drown? Perhaps it's social services in Chatham-Kent that seem to fall short of some of the people who need it most. Or maybe it's the injustice of a little church in North Buxton that people are going to get evicted from. I don't know what your storm is, but I do know that there are days that you look to God and say, "God, don't you care if I or we or they drown?" But then there's Jesus. Jesus who's napping on a cushion in the back of the boat. Who once he hears the concern of the disciples, he steps forward to the storm itself. Not to the people, not to the boat, but to the storm, and says, "Quiet, be still." Now, as I was reading through different translations of this story, the one word that kept coming up. It doesn't matter if you look at the Message or the King James, they use the word rebuke. Now, I don't know how many of you use the word rebuke in your everyday life, but I know that there are here a few parents, and more than a few grandparents, and a whole lot of you have experience in the education system, so I know that you know what a rebuking is. I bet a few of you have been on the giving end of rebuking every now and again. And let me ask you this. Does it ever sound like, I'm okay, can you just kind of quiet down a little bit? Well, I'm a parent and I know that doesn't work. And so we need to also shift our mindset about this Jesus character. When Jesus stepped up to the plate, when Jesus stood in a boat in the roiling water, in the wind and the waves, when Jesus knew that all was lost, he said, "Hey, knock it out! That's enough!" Have you ever said that to anybody? Yeah, I know. This is what happens. The hard part about this story is that we really want to cling to the pictures we have in our head that hung on the Sunday school walls of Jesus with a lamb around his shoulders. And Jesus kneeling with the children around him. I don't want to take those ideas away, for Jesus was kind and caring and compassionate. And all of us have at one time or another, I hope, experienced the inner peace of being close to God. But that is not the only way Jesus existed in the world or continues to exist in our worlds. For when push comes to shove, Jesus steps up and says, "Hey, knock it off!" I wonder what that would do to some of the stories and some of the storms in our lives. See, the one difference between Jesus and the rest of us is that Jesus isn't content to stand in the story to let the storm be the end. The inevitable, the thing that we think we can't control, the thing that's too big for us, whether it's the storm or whether it's the culture or whether it's political structure or military forces, the things that seem entirely outside of our control, Jesus says, that is not the end of the story. That will not be how this finishes. When we look at the lame and the lepers 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, we think compassionately those poor people who have a miserable and short life. Jesus saw them and said, "Get up and walk, for your faith has healed you." Or he saw them sitting by the pool and said, "Go, you are clean." When we see prostitutes and tax collectors, we know better than to hang around with people of that class. Jesus sat down with them and ate with them and reminded them that they too are beloved children of God. When we see the Roman Empire colluding with the Jewish religious authorities, we know that that power is far too big and the Hebrews are going to get the short end of that stick. And Jesus refused. And when we see a man dying on a cross, we know that must be the end of his story. Not so much Jesus. It may have taken his life, but it did not end his story. I think that is the piece that we need to hear in our gospel today. We need to hear that the storms of our lives are not the end. That Jesus is not willing to sit idly by. He may seem like he's napping in the back of the boat, but at some point Jesus is going to step into your life and say to the storm, "Hey, knock it off. You need to be part of that story. You need to take the confidence that Jesus brings and know that with the strength of God, you yourself can stand up to forces that seem bigger than you and say, knock it off. You can stand up to the injustice and the oppression that you see in this world and say, I will not let that happen. You can, and you will, be part of the change of the story. When the wind is blowing and the waves are washing over your boat, you too have the power to stand with Jesus and say, this is not the end of my story. This darkness will not overcome me. Now, whether that is something that seems far away, perhaps it's injustice in the Middle East or south of the border or right here in town, God is inviting each and every one of us to stand strong with Jesus and change the story. And whether that maybe is something in your own life, something that feels like it has grown completely outside of your control. There are powers and principalities in your life that seem to be taking over, and you get to stand shoulder to shoulder with Jesus. I love picturing him with his arm around me as we both shake our fist at the storm saying, hey, knock it off. And then sometimes you need to look in the mirror and recognize that some of the storms in your life are your own doing. Some of them stem from poor choices or choosing not to make a choice. Some of them stem from things we said that should not have been said, or things that we didn't say that maybe we should have. Some of them are the deep darkness inside of us. And in those moments too, Jesus calls us to have the courage to look in the mirror and with confidence say, hey, knock it off. Friends, Jesus has never and will never be satisfied that the storms are the end of the story. Because you know what happened next? Do you know what happened immediately after he stood up and told the storm to quit? It did. Can we just pause with that for a minute? He told the storm to quit. And it did. Now, I don't know if the disciples, if it had ever crossed their minds to look out in the waves and say, stop it! Jesus did. And in case you think perhaps your voice is not as strong as Jesus, perhaps you're worried that you are too small and too insignificant, perhaps you're concerned that one person screaming against a storm will never make a difference. I borrow a quote from Margaret Mead when she says, don't question if a small group of committed individuals can change the world. In fact, that's all that ever has. So let's change the story. Let's look the storms in the eye. Let's look ourselves in the eye. And with Jesus' help, let's say, hey, knock